I saw that he hesitated, and a bitter struggle went on in his heart, for he knew that it was his presence which kept his enemy a prisoner, that dare he to go to the other world would be free to wander through this dark land, and even yet he could hardly let him go. Then I spoke again of his wife, his child. Would he not rather go to them? The strong, passionate man broke down as he thought of those loved ones, and burying his face in his hands, wept bitter tears. I put my arm through his and let him, unresisting, out of the prison and out of the city. Here we found kind spirit friends were awaiting the poor man, and with them I left him, that they might bear him to a bright land, where he would see his wife from time to time, till he worked himself up to the level of her sphere, where they would be united forever in a happiness more perfect than could ever have been their lot on earth. I did not return to the city, for I felt my work there was done, and I so wandered in search of fresh fields of usefulness. In the middle of a dark, lonely plain, I came upon a solitary hut, in which I found a man lying on some wisps of dirty straw, unable to move, and to all appearance dying. He told me that in his hurt life he had thus abandoned and left to die a sick comrade, whom he had robbed, had both risked their lives, and that found himself lying in the same helpless, deserted way. I asked him if he would not wish to get up and go and do something to help others, and thus atone for the murder of his friend, because if so, I thought I could help him. He thought he would like to get up, certainly. He was sick of this hole, but he didn't see why he should work at anything or bother about other people. He would rather look for the money he had buried and spend that. Here his cunning eyes glanced furtively at me to see what I thought of his money, and if I was likely to try to find it. I suggested him that he ought rather to think of trying to find the friend he had murdered and make reparation to him. But he wouldn't hear of that, and go quite angry, said he was not sorry he had killed his friend, and only sorry he was here. He thought I would have helped him to get away. I tried to talk to this man and make him see how he really might better his position and undo the wrong he had done, but it was no use. His only idea was that once given the use of his limbs again, he could go and rob or kill someone else. So at last I left him where he lay, and as I went out, his feeble hand picked up a stone and flung it after me. What, I asked mentally, would become of this man? And I was answered. He has just come from earth after dying a violent death, and his spirit is weak, but ere long he will grow strong, and then he will go forth and join other marauders like himself, who go about in bands, and add another horror to this place. After the lapse of many years, it may even be centuries, the desire for better things will awake, and it will begin to progress, but very slowly, for a soul which has been in chains for so long, and is so poorly developed, so degraded as in this man, often takes cycles of time to develop it. After one dreary desolate plain. I felt so tired, weary of art, that I sat down and began musing upon what I'd seen in this awful sphere. The sight of so much evil and suffering had depressed me. The awful darkness and heavy, murky clouds oppressed my soul, that ever had loved the sunshine and the light, as I fancy only we in the southern nations love it. And then I worried, worried and longed for news from her whom I had left on earth. No word had reached me as yet from my friends, no news of my beloved. I knew not how long I had been in this place, where there was no day to mark the time, nothing but eternal night that brooded and reigned in silence over everything. My thoughts were full of my beloved, and I prayed earnestly that she might be kept safe on earth. It gladdened my eyes when the time of probation in this place should be over. While I prayed, I became conscious of a soft pale light suffuse around me, as from a glowing star, that grew and grew till it expanded and opened out into a most glorious picture frame in rays of light, and in the center I saw my darling, her eyes looking into mine and smiling at me, her sweet lips parted as though speaking my name. Then she seemed to raise her hand, and touching her lips with her fingertips, threw me a kiss. So shyly, so prettily was it done, that I was in raptures, and rose to return her that kiss, to look more closer at her, and lo, the vision had vanished, and I was alone on the dark plain once more, but no longer so sad. That bright vision had cheered me and given me hope and courage to go on once more and bring others such hope as cheered myself. I arose and went on again. In a short time was overtaken by a number of dark and most repulsive-looking spirits. They wore ragged black coats and seemed to have their faces concealed by black men. They didn't see me, and I found dwellers of the sphere were too low in intelligence and spiritual sight to be able to see anyone from the spheres above, unless brought into direct contact with them. Curious to see what they were about, I drew back and followed them a little distance. At a little distance, presently, another party of dark spirits approached, carrying what looked like bags with some sort of treasure. Immediately they were attacked by the first comers. They had no weapons in their hands, but they fought like wild beasts with teeth and claws, their fingernails being like the claws of a wild animal or a vulture. They fastened upon each other's throat and tore them. They scratched and bit like tigers or wolves, till one half at least were left lying helpless upon the ground, while the rest rushed off with the treasure, which to me seemed only lumps of hard stone. When all who were able to move had gone, I drew near the poor spirits lying moaning on the ground to see if I could. I drew near the poor spirits lying moaning on the ground to see if I could help any of them. But it seemed to be no use doing so. They only tried to turn upon me and tear me in pieces. They were more like savage beasts than men. Even their bodies were bent like a beast's, the arms long like a happy's, the hands hard, and the fingers and nails like claws, and they half walked and half crawled on all fours. The face could scarcely be called human. The very features had become bestial, while they lay snarling and showing their teeth like wolves. I thought of the strange wild tales I had read of men changing into animals, and I felt I could almost have believed these were such creatures. In their horrible glaring eyes there was an expression of calculation and cunning which was certainly human, and the motions of their hands were not like those of an animal. Moreover, they had speech and were mingling their howls and groans with oaths and curses and foul language unknown to animals. Are there souls even here? I asked. Again came an answer. Yes, degraded, almost all traces lost, yet even here they have the germ of souls. These men were pirates of the Spanish Main, highwaymen, freebooters, slave dealers, and kidnappers of men. They have so brutalized themselves that almost all trace of the human is merged in the wild animal. Their instincts were those of savage beasts. Now they live like beasts and fight like them. And for them, is there still hope, and can anyone help them, I ask. Even for these there is hope, though many will not avail themselves of it for ages yet to come. Yet here and there are others who even now can be helped. I turned, and at my feet lay a man who had dragged himself to me with great difficulty and was now too exhausted for further effort. He was less horrible to look upon than the others, and in his distorted face there were yet traces of better things. I bent over him and heard his lips murmur, "Water, water for any sake. Give me water, for I am consumed with a living fire." I had no water to give him, and knew not where to get any in this land, but I gave him a few drops of the essence I had brought from the land of down for myself. The effect upon him was like magic. It was an elixir. He sat up and stared at me and said, "You must be a magician. That has cooled me to put out the fire that has burned within me for years. I have been filled with a living fire of thirst even since I came to this hell." I had now drawn him away from the others and began to make passes over his body, and as I did so his suffering ceased and he grew quiet and restful. I was standing by him, wondering what to do next, whether to speak or go away and leave him to himself, when he caught my hand and kissed it passionately. "Oh, friend, how am I to thank you? What shall I can call you who have come to give me relief after all these years of suffering? If you are thus grateful to me, would you not wish them? Shall I show you how you could? Most gladly, if only you will take me with you, good friend." "Well, then, let me help you up, and if you're able, we had better leave this spot as soon as we can," said I, and together we set forth to see what we could do. My companion told me he had been a pirate and in the slave trade. He had been mate of a ship and was killed in a fight, and had wakened to find himself and others of the crew in this dark place. How long he had been there he had no idea, but it seemed like eternity. He and other spirits like him went about in bands and were always fighting. When they did not meet another party to fight, they fought among themselves. The thirst for fighting was the only excitement they could get in this horrible place, where there was never any drink to be got which could quench the awful burning thirst which consumed them all. That they drank only seemed to make them 1,000 times worse, and was like pouring living fire down their throats. Then he said, "You never could die, no matter what you suffered. That was the awful curse of the thing. You had got beyond that, and it was no use trying to kill yourself or get others to kill you. There was no such escape from suffering. They are like a lot of hungry wolves, he said. For want of anyone to attack us, we used to fall upon each other and fight till we were exhausted, and then we would lie moaning and suffering until we recovered enough to go forth again and attack someone else. I have been longing for any means to escape. I have almost got to praying for it at last. I felt I would do anything if God would only forgive me and let me have another chance. And when I saw you standing near me, I thought perhaps you were an angel sent down to me after all. Only you've got no wings nor anything of that sort as they paint them in pictures. But then pictures don't give you much idea of this place, and if they are wrong about one place, why not about the other? I laughed at him, yes, even in that place of sorrow I laughed. My heart felt so much lightened to find myself of so much use. And then I told him I was there, and he said if I wanted to apple swamps near where the great many unhappy spirits were imprisoned, and he could take me to them and help a bit myself, he thought. He seemed afraid to let me go out of his sight lest I should disappear and leave him alone again. I felt quite attracted to this man because he seemed so very grateful, and I was also glad of companionship for any sort, except that of those most repulsive beings who seemed the majority as well as here, for I felt lonely and somewhat desolate in this far-off, dismal country. These intense dark, the horrible atmosphere of thick fog made it almost impossible to see far in any direction, so that we reached the land of swamps before I was aware of it, except for feeling a cold, damp, offensive air which blew in our faces. Then I saw looming before me a great sea of liquid mud, black, fetid and stagnant, a thick slime of oily blackness floating on top. Here and there monstrous reptiles with huge inflated bodies and projecting eyes were wallowing. Great bats with almost human faces like vampires hovered over it, while black and grey smoke wreaths of noisome vapor rose from its decaying surface and hung over in weird fantastic phantom shapes and that shifted and changed over and anon into fresh forms of ugliness, then melting in
now waving. So it is recording. Now waving aloft while arms and shaking, nodding, gibbering heads, which seem almost endowed with sense and speech.
Then melting into myths again to form into some new creature of repulsive horror. On the shore of this great false sea were innumerable crawling, slimy creatures of hideous shape and gigantic size that lay sprawling on their backs or plunged into that and leave below, so struggling in that filthy slime, when my ears heard a chorus of wailing cries and calls for help coming from the darkness before me, that touched my heart with their mournful hopelessness, and my eyes, growing more accustomed to the mist, distinguished here and there struggling human forms wading up to their armpits in the mud. I called to them and told them to try and walk towards me, for I was on the shore, but they either could not see or could not hear me, for they took no notice, and my companion said he believed they were both deaf and blind to everything but their immediate surroundings. He had been in the sea of foul mud himself for a time, but had managed to struggle out, though he had understood that most were unable to do so without help from another, and that some went on stumbling about it for years. Again we heard those pitiful cries, and one sounded so near us that I thought of plunging in myself and trying to drag the wretched spirit out, but foul! It was too horrible, too disgusting. I recoiled in horror at the thought. And then again that despairing cry smote upon my ears and made me feel I must venture it. So I went, trying my best to stifle my sense of disgust, and, guided by the cry, soon reached the man, the great phantoms of the mist wavering and swooping and rushing overhead as I did so. He was up to his neck in the mud, and seemed sinking lower when I found him, and it seemed impossible for me alone to draw him out, so I called to the pirate spirit to come and help me, but he was nowhere to be seen. Thinking he had only led me into a trap and deserted me, I was about to turn and struggle out again, when the unfortunate spirit besought me so pitifully not to abandon him, that I made another great effort and succeeded in dragging him a few yards and drawing his feet out of the trap of weeds at the bottom in which they appeared to be caught. Then somehow I dreamed till we reached the shore, where, in unconsciousness, I was a good deal exhausted also, and sat down beside him to rest. I looked round for my pirate friend and beheld him wallowing about in the sea at some distance, and evidently bringing out someone along with him. Even in the midst of my awful surroundings, I could not help feeling a certain sense of amusement in looking at him. He made such frantic and exaggerated efforts to howl along the unlucky spirit, and was so shouting and going on, that it was calculated to alarm anyone who was timid, and I did not wonder to hear the poor spirit almost imploring him not to be so energetic, to take a little slower, and to give him time to follow. I went over to them, and the poor rescued one being now near the shore, I helped to get him out and to let him rest beside the other one. The pirate spirit seemed greatly delighted with his successful effort and very proud of himself, and was quite ready to set off again, so I sent him after someone else whom we heard calling, and was attending to the other two, when I again heard most pitiful wailings not far from me, though I could see no one at first. Then a faint, tiny speck of light, like a will-o'-the-wisp, glimmered in the darkness of that disgusting swamp, and by its light I saw someone moving about and calling for aid. Not very willingly, I confess, I went into the mud again. When I reached the man, I found he had a woman with him, whom he was supporting and trying to encourage, and with considerable trouble I got them both out, and found the pirate spirit had also arrived to his rescue. Truly a strange group we must have made on the shores of that slimy sea, which I learned afterwards was the spiritual creation of all the disgusting thoughts of the lives of men on earth. Act of foulness. Those spirits were thus wallowing in it, had reveled in so much low abominations in their earth lives, and had continued to enjoy such pleasure after death through the mediumship of mortal men and women, till at last even the earth plane had become too high for them by reason of their own exceeding vileness, and they had been drawn down by the force of attraction into this horrible sink of corruption, to wander in it till the very disgust of themselves should work a cure. Okay. One man I had rescued had been one of the celebrated wits of Charles II's court, and after his death had long haunted the earth plane, sinking, however, lower and lower till he had sunk into the sea at last, the weeds of his pride and arrogance forming chains in which his feet were so entangled that he could not move until I released them. Another man had been a celebrated dramatist of the reign of the early George, while the man and woman had belonged to the court of Louis XV and had been drawn together to this place. Those rescued by the pirate were somewhat similar in their. I had been somewhat troubled at first as to how I was going to free myself from the mud of that horrible sea, but I now suddenly saw a small clear fountain of pure water spring up near to us, as if by magic, and in its fresh stream we soon washed all traces of the mud away. I now advise those whom we have rescued to try what they could do to help others in the sand of darkness as a return for the help given to themselves, and having given them that what advice and help I could, I started once more upon my pilgrimage. The pirate, however, seemed so very unwilling to part from me that we two set forth together once more. I shall not attempt to describe all whom we sought to help in our wanderings. Were I to do so, this narrative would fill volumes and probably only weary my readers, so I shall pass over what seemed to me like weeks of earthly time, as nearly as I am able to reckon it, and will describe our arrival at the vast range of mountains whose bleak summits towered into the night sky overhead. We were both somewhat discouraged with the results of our efforts to help people. Here and there we had found a few who were willing to listen and to be helped, but as a rule our attempts had been met with scorn and derision, while not a few had even attacked us for interfering with them, and we had some trouble to save ourselves from injury. Our last attempt had been with a man and woman of most repulsive appearance who were fighting at the door of a wretched hovel. The man was beating her so terribly I could not but interfere to stop him, whereupon they both set on me at once, the exile, and I was glad to hurry forth to tell, the combined attack had made me lose my temper, and by doing so, I put myself for the moment on their level, and so was deprived of the protection afforded me by my superior spiritual development. These two had been guilty of a most cruel and brutal murder of an old man, the husband of the woman, for the sake of his money, and they had been hanged for the crime, their mutual guilt forming a bond between them so strong that they had been drawn down together and were unable to separate in spite of the bitter hatred they now felt for each other. Each felt the other to be the cause of their being in this place, and each felt the other more guilty than themselves, and it had been their eagerness each to betray the other which had helped to hang both. Now they seem simply to exist in order to fight together, and I can fancy no punishment more awful than theirs must have been, thus linked together in hate. In this present state of mind, it was not possible to help them in any way. Shortly after leaving this interesting couple, we find ourselves at the foot of a great dark mountains, and by the aid of a curious pale phosphorescent glow which hung in patches over them, we were able to explore them a little. There were no regular pathways, and the rocks were very steep, so we stumbled up at the best we might, for I should explain that by taking on certain proportion of the conditions of this low sphere, I had lost the power to rise at will and float, which was a privilege of those who had reached the land of down. After a toilsome ascent of one of the lower ranges of the mountains, we began to tramp along the crest of one, faintly lighted by the strange gleaming patches of forest on either side of us, vast rocks, gloomy precipices, and awful-looking black pits. For some of these came wailing cries and moans, and occasionally prayers for help. It was much shock to think there were spirits down in such deeps of misery, and felt quite at a loss how to help them, when my companion, who had shown a remarkable eagerness to second all my efforts to rescue people, suggested that we should make a rope from some of the great rank, withered-looking weeds and grass that grew in small crevices of these otherwise barren rocks, and with such rope I could lower him down, and he has more used to climbing in that fashion than I, and thus we might be able to draw up some of these spirits out of their dreadful position. This was a good idea, so we set to work as soon as had a rope strong enough to bear the weight of my friend. So you should know that in spiritual as well in the material things, weight is a matter of comparison, and the materiality of those low spheres will give them a much greater solidity and weight than belongs to a spirit sphere more advanced. And though to your material eyes of earth life my pirate friend would have shown neither distinct material form nor weight, yet a very small development of your spiritual faculties would have enabled you to both see and feel his presence, though a spirit of next degree higher would still remain visible to you. Thus I am not in error, nor do I ever say that what is improbable when I thus speak of my friend's weight, which for a rope made of spiritual grass and weeds was a great strain, as would have been the case with the earthly man and earth materials. Having made one end of the rope fast to a rock, the spirit descended with the speed and sureness acquired by long practice as a sailor. Once there, he soon made fast round the body of the poor helpless of one whom he felt lying moaning at the bottom. Then I drew he had made it to my friend and drew him up, and having done what we could for the rescued one, we went on help a few more in like fashion. When we had pulled out as many as we could find, a most strange thing happened. The phosphorescent light died out and left us in utter darkness, while a mysterious voice floating, as it seemed, in the air said, "Go on now, your work here is done." Those whom you have rescued were caught in their own traps, and the pitfalls that they made for others had received themselves, till that time when repentance and a desire to atone should draw rescuers to help them and free them from the prisons they had themselves made. In these mountains are many spirits imprisoned, who may not yet be helped out by any, for they would only be a danger to others were they free, and the ruin and evil they would shed around make their longer imprisonment a necessity. Yet are their prisons of their own creating, for these great mountains of misery are the outcome and product of men's earthly lives, and these precipices are but the spiritual counterparts of those precipices of despair over which they have in earthly life driven their unhappy victims. Not till their hearts soften, not till they have learned to long for liberty, that they may do good instead of evil, will their prisons be opened and they be drawn forth from the living dead, in which their unfrightful cruelties to others have entombed them. The voice ceased, and alone in the darkness we grope our way down the mountain side till we reach the level ground once more. Those awful, mysterious, dark valleys of eternal night, those towering mountains of selfishness and oppression, had struck such a chill to my heart that I was glad indeed to know to linger longer there. Our wandering now brought us to an immense forest, whose weird fantastic trees were like what one sees in some awful nightmare. The leafless branches seemed like living arms held out to grasp and hold the hapless wanderer. The long snake-like roots stretched out, some like twisting ropes to trim him out. The trunks were bare and blackened as though scorched by the blasting breath of fire. From the bark a thick foul slime oozed, and like powerful wax held fast any hand that touched it. Great waving shrouds of some strange dark hair plant clothed the branches like a pall, and helped to enfold and bewilder any who tried to penetrate through this ghostly forest. Faint, muffled cries as of those who are exhausted and half smothered came from this awful wood, and here and there we could see the imprisoned souls held captive in the embrace of these extraordinary prisons, struggling to get free, yet unable to move one single step. How I wondered, shall we help these? Some were caught by a twisted root holding them as in a vice. Another's hand was glued to the trunk of a tree. Another was enveloped in a shroud of the black moss, while yet another's head and shoulders were held fast by a couple of branches which had closely upon them, while ferocious-looking beasts prowled around them, and huge vultures flapped their wings overhead, yet seemed unable to touch any of the prisoners, though they came so near. Who were these men and women? I asked. They are those, as was the reply, who viewed with delight the suffering of others, those who gave their fellow men to be torn in pieces by wild beasts that they might enjoy the excitement of their slings. They are those who, for no reason but the loss of cruelty, have, in many different ways and in many different ages, tortured and entrapped themselves, and for only come when they have learned the lesson of mercy and pity for others, and the desire to save someone else from suffering, even at the expense of suffering to themselves. Then will these bands of fetters which hold them be loosened. Then they will be free to go forth and work out their atonement. Till then, no one else can help them, none can release them. Their release must be effected by themselves through their own more merciful desires and aspirations. If you will but recall the history of your earth and think how men in all ages have enslaved, oppressed, and tortured their fellow men in every country of that globe, you will not wonder that this vast forest should be well peopled. It was deemed right that for your own instruction you should see this fearful place, but as none of those you see and pity have so far changed their hearts that you can give them aid, you will now pass on to another region where you can do more good. After leaving the forest of desolation, we had not gone far upon our road. Then to my joy I saw my friend Hassan approaching. Mindful, however, of Ariziman's warning, I gave him the sign agreed upon and received the countersign in return. He had come, he said, with a message from my father and from my beloved, who had sent me what were indeed sweet words of love and encouragement. Hassan told me that my mission would not lie amongst those great masses of spirit whose evil propensities were equalled only by their intellectual powers and their ingenuity to work of evil. They are those, said he, who were rulers of men and kings of intellect in all branches, but who have perverted and abused the power with which they were endowed, till they have made of them a curse and not a blessing. With most of them you will have to guard yourself at all points against the allurements they will hold and they will practice on yourself. Yet you are sent to succor, and whom your own instinct and events will point out as those to whom your words will be welcome and your aid valuable. I shall not in all probability bring you messages again, but some of them may be sent to do so, and you must, above all things and before all things, remember to distrust any who come to you and cannot give the sign and symbol I have given. You are now in reality about to invade the enemy's camp, and you will find that your errand is known to them and resented, whatever it may suit them to pretend. Beware then of all their false promises, and when they seem most friendly, distrust them most. I promised to remember and heed his warning, and he added that it was necessary I should part for a time from my faithful companion the pirate, as he could not safely accompany me in these scenes to which my path would now lead, but he promised he would place him under the care of one who could and would help him to leave that dark country soon. After giving him loving and hopeful messages to my beloved and my father, which he promised to deliver to them, we parted, and I set forth in the direction pointed out, greatly cheered and comforted by the good news and loving messages I had received.